There was something moving inside my uterus, and it wasn't human. Every month, like clockwork, she had diarrhea, fever, and crippling pain. For years, doctors told her it was just stress, just hormones, but then came the scan, the one that changed everything. They found a parasite living in her womb, a real living organism nesting where life was supposed to begin. This is the true story of Emily Carter, of what lived inside her and what it took to survive not just the infection but the silence, the disbelief, the unraveling of identity itself. If this first line made you pause, then you need to hear the whole story. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and follow for more real-life stories that will change how you see the human body and the human spirit. It started like every other Monday, coffee in hand, laptop open, inbox overloaded. The office buzzed with a faint artificial hum, the kind you stop noticing until silence replaces it. My stomach cramped, sharp, precise, like something inside me was being pinched from the inside. I glanced at the calendar on my screen, July 11, first day of my period. Again, I pressed a hand to my abdomen, swallowing a wince, and stood to make my way to the restroom. The pain had become familiar over the past several months, but it was getting worse, more violent. As I pushed open the restroom door, the nausea struck. It was like a wave, crashing, unrelenting. My head spun. The walls seemed to tilt. I barely locked the stall before I dropped to my knees. Sweat broke out on my neck, hot and cold all at once. My stomach turned violently, and I vomited into the toilet, dry heaving until there was nothing left but air and panic. A ringing sound started in my ears, dull and rising, and my vision flickered with black edges. I remember grasping for the lock, fumbling, then nothing. When I opened my eyes, a faint fluorescent light flickered above me. My cheek was pressed against the cool tile of the bathroom floor. I was lying on my side, curled like a question mark, my body soaked with sweat. The sound of someone banging on the stall door echoed like thunder. "Emily? Are you okay in there?" "Emily?" I couldn't answer. My lips parted, but no sound came out. Eventually, they forced the door open, paramedics, the hallway lights, the rush of a gurney, a cold stethoscope, a dozen hands pulling at my sleeves, the concerned face of my manager, pale and tight-lipped, looming in my fading peripheral vision. At the ER, they ran tests, blood work, vitals, CT scan, even a stool sample. Everything came back normal. The attending physician chalked it up to stress, maybe dehydration. "It could be IBS," he said, shrugging. "You're a young woman. These things happen." He smiled kindly, too kindly. It felt like he was trying to convince himself more than me. I went home with anti-nausea pills, a bottle of electrolyte water, and instructions to take it easy. But it wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. For over a year, my body had been sending signals I couldn't interpret. Every month, like clockwork, the same pattern: abdominal cramping, explosive diarrhea, waves of heat and chills, low-grade fever that spiked for a few hours then faded like nothing had happened. Doctors said it was PMS, or stress-related colitis, or maybe a food intolerance. I changed my diet: no gluten, no dairy, no caffeine. I meditated. I journaled. I drank ginger tea by the gallon. Nothing helped. Friends offered unsolicited advice. "Have you tried probiotics? Maybe it's hormonal." "It's probably just anxiety." I nodded, smiled, pretended to agree. But deep down, I was terrified. Because it wasn't just pain, it was violence. Something inside me felt wrong, foreign, like I was being attacked from within, systematically, rhythmically, every month without fail. The worst part wasn't the pain, it was the gaslighting, by strangers, by doctors, and eventually by myself. I began to doubt what I felt. I questioned my own sensitivity. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was, in fact, overreacting. But my body knew better, and it refused to be ignored. I remember one night vividly. It was 3 months before the bathroom collapse. I was lying in bed, curled on my side, clutching a heating pad to my belly. The cramping had started earlier than usual. I checked the time, 2:43 a.m. A low fever simmered behind my eyes. I could feel every beat of my heart inside my skull. I wanted to scream, but didn't have the strength. As I lay there, a strange sensation passed through my pelvis, a sort of shifting, almost like a flutter, deep and low. Not painful, not exactly, just disturbing. It felt like something was moving, alive. The next morning, the fever was gone. The diarrhea had passed. I got up, took a shower, put on makeup, and went to work like nothing had happened. But inside, something was unraveling. No one understood. Not my mother, not my friends, not even the specialists. "You look perfectly healthy," they'd say. And I did. I ate well, exercised, slept decently. I wasn't overweight. I didn't smoke or drink. I wasn't a hypochondriac. But I was afraid. Because the symptoms weren't random, they came exactly with my menstrual cycle, as if my body was counting down to a monthly purge. Something about it felt precise, too precise to be coincidence. In the quiet of the night, I started keeping notes, dates, times, fever spikes, pain levels. I color-coded them, created graphs. Patterns emerged. Each month, the symptoms peaked on day 1 of my period and disappeared by day 3, like a switch being flipped on and off. It was horrifying in its consistency. Still, no one listened. I didn't know it then, but my body had been trying to warn me all along. There was something inside me, something real, not imagined, not hormonal, not psychological, something alive. There's something uniquely cruel about being in pain that no one else can see. Worse still when the people who are supposed to help you look at you like you're a little unhinged. I remember sitting in the examination room, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the paper on the table crinkling beneath me as I shifted uncomfortably. The doctor was young, maybe just out of residency, with kind eyes but a rehearsed smile. He asked all the usual questions. Any stress at work? Trouble sleeping? Relationship issues? I told him about the pain, sharp, cyclical, the vomiting, the fever, the gastrointestinal chaos that came exactly with the start of every period. He typed as I spoke, nodded politely, then suggested I try yoga. "Stress can manifest in strange ways," he said, printing off a pamphlet titled Understanding PMS and Anxiety. I stared at it blankly, then folded it once, twice, into a tiny square and shoved it into my purse. It wasn't that I didn't want to believe them. A part of me wished they were right. Stress, at least, was manageable. Yoga I could do. But deep in my gut, literally, I knew they were wrong. Still, doubt is a parasite of its own. It feeds on repetition, on denial. And when enough people suggest the problem is in your head, it's hard not to start believing it. I began to wonder if I was too sensitive, too dramatic. Maybe I was exaggerating the symptoms in my mind. Maybe other women went through this kind of agony every month and just didn't talk about it. So I did what I always do when I feel uncertain. I researched. Late at night, when the world was quiet and my body temporarily calm, I would scroll through forums, read medical journals, compare symptoms. I found terms like endometriosis, adenomyosis, dysmenorrhea. I fell down rabbit holes of rare autoimmune conditions and parasitic infections. Nothing ever fit quite right. I tried every remedy I could find: herbal teas that promise balance, heating pads, over-the-counter meds, essential oils. I started journaling my symptoms meticulously, bought a basal thermometer to track my temperature fluctuations. I became a detective of my own biology, determined to find the pattern, to solve the mystery. Every month, like a grim ritual, I braced myself. I stocked my bathroom with electrolytes, soft toilet paper, ginger chews. I canceled plans, made excuses. I think I ate something bad, just a little stomach bug. But it was never food poisoning. It was never a bug. It was always the same invisible monster arriving with terrifying precision. One evening, while out with friends, the symptoms hit early. We were at a small Italian restaurant, halfway through appetizers, when a wave of nausea crashed over me so hard I thought I might faint. I excused myself, barely made it to the bathroom. I sat on the cold tile floor, my back against the wall, arms wrapped around my midsection, trying to breathe through the spasms. When I returned to the table, pale and trembling, they looked at me with a mixture of concern and something else: skepticism. "You sure it's not anxiety?" one of them asked gently. "You've been under a lot of pressure lately." I nodded, muttered something non-committal, and took an Uber home before dessert. It was after that night that I stopped talking about it. I withdrew, not just socially, but emotionally. I became an expert at hiding, at smiling through pain, at pretending. I showed up at work, delivered on deadlines, made small talk in the elevator. No one suspected that beneath my professional exterior was a woman unraveling month by month. There were times I almost convinced myself it would pass, that maybe if I just waited long enough, it would go away. Our bodies were strange, weren't they? They healed, they adapted. But mine wasn't healing, it was screaming. I began to have dreams, fragmented, unsettling. In one, I stood in a sterile room watching doctors poke at something inside me. I couldn't see their faces, only their gloved hands. One of them reached into my abdomen and pulled out a mass of something slick and dark like seaweed. I woke up drenched in sweat, my hands clenched into fists. My mother called one afternoon, sensing something in my voice. "You sound tired, Em. Are you sleeping okay?" "Just a lot going on at work," I lied. "You've lost weight. I can hear it in your voice." "I'm fine, Mom." But I wasn't. I avoided the mirror. The thought of looking at my own body made my skin crawl. I felt betrayed, like my insides were conspiring against me. I didn't want to be touched. I didn't want to be asked how I was feeling, because the answer would be too complicated, too terrifying. It's strange the way pain becomes part of you, like a roommate you hate but have learned to live with. You stop fighting it, you make space for it, you schedule your life around its needs. That's what I had done. Pain had become predictable, even if its cause remained elusive. Then came the morning I collapsed at work. That was the moment the denial cracked open. The body, as always, refused to lie. It would not be soothed by yoga or silenced by polite suggestions. It had a message to deliver, and it was done waiting for me to listen. The body has a way of making itself heard when it's been ignored too long. Mine, exhausted from my attempts to silence it with logic and self-doubt, finally snapped. The day after my collapse at work, I lay on the couch in my apartment, a heating pad pressed to my abdomen, a faint fever humming just beneath the skin. The apartment was silent, curtains drawn against the harsh Arizona sun, and my breath came shallow and slow, as if my lungs had lost confidence in themselves. There was a terrifying stillness inside me. Not calm, no, it was the quiet of anticipation, the way the air changes before a storm. My body had begun staging a rebellion I could no longer contain. The pain was not just a symptom now, it was a language, and I was finally listening. I tried to recall when it all started, when the pain first broke away from the realm of normal and started morphing into something else, something darker. It wasn't just the cramping anymore. It was the vomiting, the chills, the full body collapse. It was the way my mind felt fogged over, disconnected from my limbs, as if the signal between thought and movement had been severed, like I was piloting someone else's malfunctioning machinery. That week, I called out sick from work. It was the first time in 5 years that I had done so for more than a day. My manager sounded concerned, but also mildly annoyed. "Of course, take care of yourself," she said. But beneath the politeness, I could feel the impatience, the quiet questioning. Was it really that bad? Again? My mother offered to come stay with me, and for the first time I said yes. She arrived with homemade soup, peppermint tea, and that maternal look of thinly veiled worry. She sat beside me on the couch, her hand resting gently on my knee, and for a while, neither of us said anything. That night, the pain returned with a vengeance. It started in my lower back, radiating forward like a heat wave. Then the nausea, sudden and brutal. I crawled to the bathroom, clutching my stomach, and barely made it before the dry heaving started. I remember the sound of my mother's footsteps pounding down the hallway, the sharp knock on the door. "Emily?" I couldn't answer. I was too busy trying not to scream. She opened the door and found me on the tile floor, shaking, soaked in sweat. I looked up at her face and saw something I hadn't seen before. Fear. Real fear. And in that moment, I saw the shift. This wasn't just something in my head anymore. It wasn't stress. It wasn't hormones. It was real. And it terrified both of us. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, cradling a mug of tea I wasn't drinking. My mother moved quietly around the apartment, pretending not to watch me, but I felt her eyes. I had barely slept. My body was drained, not just from the episode, but from the weight of having someone else witness it, really witness it, for the first time. That look in her eyes haunted me. My mother had never been one to overreact. She believed in firm hands, measured words, and handling things. But now, even she seemed at a loss. "I think it's time you saw someone else," she said finally, her voice careful, soft but firm. "A specialist. Maybe a gynecologist. This feels cyclical." She didn't need to say more. She was right. Deep down, I had always known the timing wasn't a coincidence. The symptoms didn't just align with my cycle. They mirrored it, danced around it, mimicked it like a twisted echo. I booked an appointment the same day. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and lavender, a strange combination that unsettled me. I filled out a stack of forms, circling boxes with symptoms I had memorized like verses of a song. Cramping, nausea, diarrhea, fever, or fatigue, all recurring, all unexplained. The receptionist called my name and I followed her down a long hallway, each step echoing with the sound of doubt and anticipation. Dr. Helen Lewis was older than I expected. Gray curls framed her face, and deep lines around her mouth suggested a lifetime of hearing difficult truths. She greeted me with a handshake that was firm but kind, her eyes alert but not invasive. I told her everything, from the first cramps to the latest collapse. I watched her face for signs of skepticism, the telltale narrowing of the eyes, the too quick nod. But it didn't come. She listened, really listened. When I finished, she leaned back slightly, tapping a pen against her lower lip. "You've done your homework," she said. "That's good. But let's stop guessing." She suggested a full pelvic exam, along with an internal ultrasound. "We need to see what's going on. You mentioned the symptoms start on day 1. That tells me something's being triggered hormonally. But if something's flaring that aggressively, we may catch it in the tissue." The exam was uncomfortable. Cold instruments, stirrups, fluorescent lights. I clenched my fists the whole time, trying not to wince. Then came the ultrasound. A small screen flickered to life beside me, grainy gray images dancing in motion as the probe moved. Dr. Lewis squinted at the screen, her brows pulling together. "What is it?" I asked, my voice small. She didn't answer immediately. "I see something," she murmured. "I'm not sure what yet. But it's not typical." I lay there, heart thudding, frozen by the calm in her voice. She printed the images and sent me for lab work. Before I left, she handed me her card and said, "We're going to figure this out, Emily, I promise." And somehow, I believed her. There was something different about Dr. Helen Lewis, something I hadn't encountered in any of the other doctors I'd seen. Maybe it was her silence, the way she allowed space between my words, the way she didn't interrupt or try to shape my story to fit into neat diagnostic boxes. She didn't rush, didn't condescend. She treated my symptoms not as random complaints, but as clues, fragments of a larger picture we hadn't yet assembled. When I returned to her office 2 days later, my lab work hadn't revealed much, no major hormonal imbalances, no inflammatory markers, no infections that could explain the fevers or digestive symptoms. But Dr. Lewis wasn't discouraged. She looked over the ultrasound images again, then called in a radiologist for a second opinion. Together, they examined the scan like archaeologists unearthing something ancient and unexpected. "There's a thickening here." She pointed to a shadowed region near the uterine wall, "and some movement, possibly vascular, possibly something else. Movement." That word lodged itself in my chest like a shard of ice. She said it without alarm, without drama, but it echoed in my mind long after I left the clinic. Movement wasn't normal. Movement wasn't supposed to happen inside the uterus. Not like that. Not during an ultrasound. She recommended a biopsy. "Just to be sure," she said. "I'd rather be overcautious than dismiss something unusual." I agreed, partly out of desperation, partly out of trust. There was a steadiness in her that made me feel less alone, less crazy. Maybe that was the beginning of hope. The procedure was scheduled for the following week. I spent the days leading up to it in a strange fog, balancing between fear and anticipation. My mother stayed with me, sensing the tension. She cooked, cleaned, folded laundry I didn't ask her to. We didn't talk much about the test. Instead, we existed in quiet orbit around each other, bound by a mutual understanding neither of us could name. At night, I lay awake, hand on my abdomen, trying to feel what was happening inside me. Was something really moving? Could that be possible? The idea clung to me like a shadow, and my dreams turned darker. In one, I saw myself from above, lying on a surgical table, doctors peering into a cavity in my body where something pulsed and writhed. I woke, gasping, drenched in sweat, and unable to shake the image. The morning of the biopsy, the air felt heavy. The clinic lights were brighter than I remembered, the walls more sterile, the smell more clinical. I changed into a gown, the paper thin and crinkly against my skin. Dr. Lewis greeted me with a gentle nod and explained the steps again. I barely heard her. My ears were full of my own heartbeat. As I lay back on the table, legs in stirrups, I closed my eyes and counted my breaths. 1, 2, 3, a pinch, a pull, pressure, then silence. She said she'd be in touch as soon as the results were ready. The waiting was the hardest part. Each day crawled by with the weight of something unspoken pressing down on me. I tried to distract myself, movies, books, long walks with no destination. But nothing could silence the low hum of fear growing louder in my chest. I kept checking my phone, refreshing my email like the results might arrive early by sheer force of will. 4 days later, the call came. Dr. Lewis's voice was steady, but something in her tone had changed. It was quieter, more deliberate. She asked if I could come in that afternoon to discuss the results in person. I said yes, of course, and then sat motionless on my bed for a long time, my phone still in my hand. The clinic felt colder than before. Or maybe it was just me. Dr. Lewis ushered me into her office, closed the door, and took a long breath before she spoke. She handed me a printed report, but I couldn't bring myself to read it. I looked at her instead, waiting. "We found evidence of a parasite," she said, choosing each word with surgical care. "Specifically, a species of flatworm, Fasciola hepatica, commonly known as the liver fluke." The room narrowed. The words didn't make sense, didn't register. "Parasite? Flatworm? In my uterus?" she continued, calm and clinical. "It's extremely rare in humans, and even more rare for it to be located where we found it. Typically, it infects livestock, cattle, sheep, through contaminated water or undercooked liver. In humans, it tends to migrate to the liver or bile ducts. But in your case, it appears to have moved beyond that, into me. I couldn't speak, couldn't think. All I could do was stare at her, heart pounding, ears ringing. A parasite had been living inside me, possibly for months, possibly longer. We believe the organism traveled through the bloodstream after initial ingestion and somehow established itself in the uterine lining, she said. The recurring inflammation and symptoms you've experienced, fever, cramping, GI distress, were likely your immune system's response to its activity, which appears to escalate with hormonal changes. My throat went dry. "How did it get there?" I whispered. She paused, then said gently, "We'll need to explore your dietary history, travel exposure, anything that might give us clues. But it's very likely you ingested it at some point through contaminated food. Most likely undercooked beef liver." I felt sick. That fluttering sensation I dismissed months ago, the one I told myself was a trick of the nerves, anxiety, imagination, it had been real. Something had been inside me, living, growing, nesting. Dr. Lewis placed a hand on the report. "The good news is we caught it, and now we can treat it." But I barely heard her. My mind was elsewhere, spiraling, trying to reconcile the horror of what I just learned with the months of dismissal, of smiling doctors and herbal teas and people telling me it was all in my head. It wasn't in my head. It had never been in my head. It had been inside my body, alive and feeding, and no one had believed me, not even me. I didn't go home right away. After leaving the clinic, I walked, no direction, no destination, just moved my legs, one in front of the other, through the streets of Phoenix beneath a blistering sun I didn't feel. My body moved, but my mind floated somewhere else, suspended between understanding and denial. A parasite, a flatworm, living inside me. The phrase repeated itself like a curse, each syllable echoing in my skull. This wasn't a metaphor, wasn't some poetic lament about womanhood or trauma or illness. It was literal. There was, or had been, a living organism, a primitive, mindless creature, inside the most intimate part of my body, feeding, thriving. The nausea returned. Not physical this time, but something deeper, something spiritual, a kind of revulsion that had no name. My stomach churned, my skin crawled, and all I could think was, how long had I carried it? How long had I ignored its presence? And why had no one believed me? I stopped at a park bench and sat down. The heat pressed down like a weight, but I didn't sweat. Everything inside me had gone cold. I looked at my hands, pale, trembling. They didn't look like mine. I wondered if I was still me. When I got home, my mother was in the kitchen stirring a pot on the stove. The smell of chicken broth filled the apartment. I dropped my keys into the bowl near the door and stood there, motionless. She turned and looked at me, and in that second she knew. Her hands stilled and she whispered, "What did they say?" I shook my head. I couldn't speak. Not yet. That night, I lay in bed with the lights off, eyes wide open. The room was quiet, but my mind buzzed with noise. Images of the ultrasound screen, the black and white static, the strange ripple Dr. Lewis had seen. Had it been moving? Had I felt it move? That strange flutter I dismissed. Had it been it? I remembered the dreams, the slick masks, the sensation of being watched from within. They weren't dreams anymore. They were warnings. Warnings I had failed to heed. I touched my lower abdomen, half expecting to feel something push back. I didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been shared, that my body hadn't been mine alone, that each month as I bled, something inside me had celebrated. The next morning, I opened my laptop and began reading everything I could find. Fasciola hepatica, life cycle, transmission, rare in humans, more common in developing countries, in people who consumed contaminated watercress or undercooked liver. It migrates from the intestines to the liver, sometimes the lungs. But the uterus? There were no documented cases I could find. None. I wasn't just sick, I was an anomaly. The words blurred on the screen. My eyes burned. I closed the laptop and buried my face in my hands. The knowledge brought no comfort, only isolation. I wasn't just fighting an infection, I was unearthing a truth that no one was prepared for. The days that followed blurred together like watercolors bleeding on wet paper. My mother tiptoed around the apartment, careful not to ask too many questions. She made tea I didn't drink, folded laundry I hadn't touched. At night, I'd hear her on the phone in the living room, whispering to someone, probably my father, her voice low and strained. I didn't want to know what she said. I didn't want to hear my condition spoken aloud, reduced to words like infection or treatment. Instead, I stayed in my room, the blinds drawn, light filtering in like diluted hope. I spent hours tracing the outline of my own body under the sheets, trying to reconcile the space I occupied with the knowledge of what had once lived inside it. It wasn't a tumor, it wasn't cancer, it wasn't a hormonal imbalance. It was a living being. Primitive, yes, but alive. And that distinction changed everything. I began to see myself differently. I stared at my reflection, trying to recognize the face that had coexisted with the unthinkable. The woman in the mirror looked the same brown eyes, same faint scar on the chin, but I felt estranged from her. She had hosted a secret. She had shared her blood, her tissues, her warmth with an invader month after month unknowingly. It made me question everything, my instincts, my memory, my trust in my own senses. I had felt something. I had known something wasn't right, and yet I had let others convince me otherwise, doctors, friends, even my own mind. That betrayal echoed louder than the diagnosis itself. I began journaling again, not just symptoms this time, but thoughts. Raw, unfiltered, some entries read like confessions, others like accusations. I wrote to remind myself that what I felt was real, that I hadn't imagined it, that pain had been my body's way of speaking. And I had learned too late to listen. One night, as I sat at the edge of my bed, I had a sudden urge to purge. Not physically, but symbolically. I went to the bathroom and stared at the drawer where I kept the herbal remedies, the teas, the supplements, all the failed attempts to fix myself. One by one, I threw them into a plastic bag, each thud a tiny release of anger. They hadn't helped. They had only delayed the truth. I scheduled a follow-up appointment with Dr. Lewis. When I arrived, she greeted me with the same calm professionalism, but her eyes softened when she saw me. "How are you feeling?" she asked. I hesitated before answering. "I'm not sure. Different. Like, I've shed something I didn't know I was carrying." She nodded slowly, as if she understood more than I had said. We discussed next steps, medication, imaging, monitoring. But more than that, we spoke about what it meant to live in a body that had been compromised, not just medically, but existentially. As I left her office, I realized the fear hadn't gone away. It had only changed shape. I was no longer afraid of what was inside me. I was afraid of what it had taken from me. Trust, certainty, ownership. And I was determined to take it back. I kept asking myself the same question, over and over, like an obsession I couldn't quiet. How did it get in? The parasite had not just appeared. It had entered me somehow, somewhere, sometime. It had traveled through my body, evading every defense system, making its home in a place sacred and unprotected. That kind of violation doesn't happen by accident. It finds an opening, a weakness, an opportunity. And once inside, it waits. Patient. Silent. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook open, pen in hand, trying to backtrack my steps to build a timeline, not just of symptoms, but of meals, trips, habits. What had I eaten? Where had I gone? Who had I been with? Dr. Lewis had suggested we trace my dietary exposure, Most cases of fasciola infection occurred from contaminated water or undercooked liver, particularly from cattle or sheep. I hadn't traveled abroad in years, no hiking in marshlands, no street food in unfamiliar villages. I lived in Arizona, for God's sake. My idea of risk was a bad burrito. Still, something clicked, a memory. Simple, ordinary, insidious. There was a small Mexican diner near my old apartment, tucked behind a gas station and barely marked. I had started going there in college, mostly for the atmosphere, casual, unassuming, open late. Their signature dish? Figado estilo ranchero, beef liver pan-seared with onions and chili oil. I used to order it rare, just how they served it. It was a guilty pleasure, something I never told many people about. The last time I ate there must have been over a year ago, just before I moved. Around the time the symptoms began, I wrote it down, circled it. That single meal, warm, spiced, familiar, might have been the moment everything changed. It was terrifying how mundane it had been, how easy. No dramatic travel story. No jungle water or survival trek, just a plate of liver, cooked a little too rare, eaten on a rainy Thursday night while scrolling my phone. And in that moment, a microscopic invader entered me. I thought back to the first wave of symptoms. Nothing dramatic, just some discomfort, a light fever. Then came the gut issues, the fatigue, and eventually the cycle of sickness that followed my own biology like it had memorized me. I called Dr. Lewis the next morning and told her what I remembered. She asked for the name of the diner, said she would pass the information to the local health authorities. This might help prevent future infections, she said, but I barely heard her. I was still reeling from the realization that I had, quite literally, invited this thing into my body, paid for it, tipped for it. The betrayal wasn't just biological, it was existential. I had always believed my body was my own, that nothing could live in me without my permission. But I had given permission. Unknowingly, yes, but willingly. I hadn't just been infected, I had been infiltrated. Later that week, I received a call from the health department. A calm, practiced voice confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The diner had been under informal investigation before. Nothing serious, just a few flagged shipments. But after Dr. Lewis submitted her findings in my records, they traced a particular batch of offal, liver imported without proper inspection, likely from a small processing operation near the Mexican border. The report was clinical, controlled. They thanked me for my cooperation. I hung up without saying much, but in my chest a new weight had settled. It wasn't the liver that haunted me. It wasn't even the fact that I'd consumed it. It was how ordinary it all had been, how something so life-altering could come from something so routine. We grow up learning that danger has a shape, sharp teeth, dark alleys, strangers with knives. But this danger had no teeth. It had flavor, spice, comfort. That meal had been a ritual for me, quiet indulgence after long work days, a return to something that felt familiar. But what was comfort, really, if it masked risk? If it dulled intuition? How many other things had I welcomed out of habit, not knowing they carried consequence? I found myself scrubbing the kitchen, the bathroom, the corners of my apartment, as if I could bleach away the vulnerability. But nothing worked, because the invader was no longer there. The invasion had already happened, and it had changed me. What unnerved me most wasn't the parasite, it was how long it had taken me to believe myself. I remembered the first flutter deep in my pelvis, that tiny shiver I'd blamed on nerves or indigestion. It hadn't hurt, it hadn't screamed. It had whispered, and I had ignored it. What else had I ignored? That thought lingered in the quiet moments, early mornings, late nights. I started replaying everything in my life that had felt off. The relationships I'd stayed in too long, the warning signs I'd reasoned away, the instincts I'd silenced to make others comfortable. The parasite had not just fed off my body. It had revealed something I hadn't wanted to see, that somewhere along the way, I had stopped trusting myself. This realization didn't come with fury. It came with stillness, a cold, undeniable truth I had to sit with. I wasn't just a host to a foreign organism. I had become a stranger to myself. And now, with the diagnosis in hand and the source identified, I stood at the edge of a deeper unraveling, because even though the creature inside me was gone, its echo remained, in my tissue, in my memory, in the shifting relationship I had with the very vessel I lived in. The question was no longer how it got in. The question was, how would I ever feel safe in my own body again? There are wounds that bleed, and wounds that change the way you move through the world. I wasn't bleeding anymore, but something inside me had shifted irreversibly. It wasn't just the parasite that had unsettled me. It was what its presence had exposed. There was a silence in my body now, but it wasn't peace. It was vacancy. And I couldn't tell if that emptiness was healing or hollowing. I became hyper-aware of my body, of every pulse, every twitch, every breath. I couldn't touch my lower abdomen without flinching, not because it hurt, but because I no longer trusted it. The space that had once held pain now held memory, and memory, I was learning, could be just as violent. I avoided mirrors. When I did catch glimpses of myself in windows and reflections, I didn't recognize the woman looking back. She seemed watchful, guarded. Her eyes were darker, like something inside her had turned inward and refused to come back up. She looked like someone who had survived something she couldn't yet name. My clothes felt wrong. My skin felt foreign. I stopped wearing anything tight, anything that reminded me of the outlines of my own shape. I wanted to disappear into softness. Sweaters, blankets, shadows. There were moments, especially at night, when I felt as if I was being haunted by my own body. Not in the supernatural sense, but in the deeply human one. The kind where you no longer feel like you belong in your own skin. Where your body no longer feels like a home, but a story someone else has written without your permission. I stopped returning phone calls, stopped responding to texts. Friends asked if I was okay, if I needed anything. I said I was fine. They believed me. They always had. But I wasn't fine. I was unraveling. The parasite was gone, but the violation remained. Not just biological, but existential. Something had trespassed, crossed a sacred threshold, and now every part of me felt exposed, invaded, like I'd been opened and stitched back together, but wrong. Sometimes I had dreams. Not the visceral ones with creatures or surgeries. These were quieter. In one, I stood in front of a mirror and watched myself smile, except the smile wasn't mine. It was something borrowed, too wide, too calm. In another, I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My reflection whispered instead, mouthing words I couldn't hear. I woke from those dreams more exhausted than before I'd closed my eyes. I knew I needed help, but I didn't know what kind. Doctors could treat infections. But what do you give a person who no longer feels like a person? I began to write again, not to understand, but to witness. I wrote letters I never sent, letters to my body, letters to the thing that had lived inside me, letters to the girl I had been before all of this began. Some of them started with "I'm sorry," some with "I didn't know," some with nothing at all, just silence on a page. I didn't expect the panic to come in the grocery store. I was in the produce aisle reaching for a bag of spinach when something triggered it. A memory, maybe, a smell, the sharpness of raw greens, earthy and wet. I froze, hand hovering mid-air, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. The air turned thick, my heart pounded, the edges of my vision blurred. I dropped the bag, turned, and left the cart behind. I walked out without paying, without even trying to explain. Back home, I sat on the bathroom floor, my back against the cold tile, arms wrapped around my knees. I tried to ground myself, breathe in for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 6, but the numbers unraveled. I felt unmoored, like I was floating above my own body, watching someone I didn't recognize fall apart over a bag of spinach. I wasn't afraid of food, not really. I was afraid of memory, of triggers that made no logical sense but carried the weight of something cellular, something buried. That day, the greens reminded me of the reading I'd done weeks earlier, how liver flukes often enter through aquatic plants, like watercress, how they nest in warm tissue, how they migrate. My mind filled in the rest, not just images, but sensations. I remembered the fevered nights, the twisting cramps, the phantom flutter. I remembered the ultrasound, the black and white ripple across the screen that should not have been there. And then, more than anything, I remembered the silence afterward, the way I had gone home and simply waited, as if my body would return to me on its own, as if trust could regrow like skin, but it hadn't. Not yet. I tried therapy, virtual sessions at first. I told the therapist I'd been through a medical scare, nothing life-threatening, but disorienting. She nodded, used words like trauma response and reclaiming agency. I listened. I took notes. But part of me didn't believe I could be fixed, because I didn't feel broken. I felt rewritten. I wasn't mourning a loss. I was mourning a disconnection. There's something sacred about inhabiting your body fully, about feeling at home in your skin. I had taken that for granted. Now, every gesture felt alien. I looked at my hands and thought, these have touched the edge of something unspeakable. These carried groceries, typed emails, touched lovers. while something else lived quietly just beneath the surface. That kind of betrayal doesn't scream, it whispers. And the whisper stays. One night I stood in front of the mirror and lifted my shirt slowly, staring at my abdomen. There was no scar, no mark, no evidence that anything had ever gone wrong. But I knew. I traced an invisible circle over my skin, the site where the creature had nested, hidden from every scan until it had grown bold enough to be seen. "I'm still here," I whispered to myself. It was the first time I'd said it aloud. It didn't sound like victory, but it sounded like beginning. No one ever tells you that the fear of losing something often begins before you know for certain it's gone. It sneaks in like fog, obscuring everything you once believed about the future. For me, that fog began to roll in the day Dr. Lewis called me back in. She had reviewed more scans, consulted with a reproductive specialist, and wanted to walk me through their findings. Her voice on the phone was kind but careful, like someone approaching a wounded animal. I sat in her office, the paper gown wrapped around my waist, like a symbol of exposure. Dr. Lewis pulled up an image on the screen, an MRI, detailed and cold. She pointed to the uterine lining where irregularities still remained. "There's been damage," she said. "We won't know the full extent until later, but the parasite left inflammation in areas that are critical to implantation." The words didn't register at first. "Are you saying I might not be able to—" I couldn't finish the sentence. She softened. "There's a possibility your fertility has been affected, not necessarily lost, but compromised." Compromised. Such a clinical word. It sounded so much gentler than what I heard in my head, broken, stolen, erased. I nodded, as if I understood, but inside, something cracked. That night, I lay awake and stared at the ceiling, trying to imagine a life without children. Not just the idea of parenting, but the idea that my body might never hold another body inside it, not in the way it was meant to. I thought of the parasite, how it had done exactly that, how it had taken residence, how it had survived, how it had claimed a space never meant for it. It felt like a mockery, a cruel cosmic irony. I thought back to when I was a girl, no more than 6, cradling baby dolls in blankets, whispering lullabies I made up on the spot. I used to wrap pillows under my shirt, pretending to be pregnant. I would walk around the living room with my hands on my belly, imagining what it might feel like, something growing, something waiting. That version of me had no idea how fragile that dream really was. When I called my mother the next day, I didn't plan to tell her. But the words came before I could stop them. "They said I might not be able to have children," I whispered. There was silence on the line. Then carefully, "Did they say never?" "No, just maybe not easily." Another pause. Then gently, "Sweetheart, having a child doesn't define you. You know that, right?" I wanted to believe her. I wanted those words to land somewhere soft. But they floated above me, untouchable, as if they belonged to another woman with another life. Because the truth was, I didn't want a life defined by lack. I didn't want to rewrite my future in response to someone else's trespass. But maybe now, I'd have to. The days that followed were the quiet kind of painful, not loud or dramatic, but slow, like a tide pulling something away that you're not ready to release. I found myself staring at strangers, women pushing strollers, a toddler crying in the cereal aisle, a pregnant woman rubbing her belly absent-mindedly in line at the pharmacy. Each moment struck like a stone against glass. I wasn't jealous, not exactly. It was something more complex, grief for a future I had once assumed was mine. I tried to be rational. The doctor hadn't said never. She hadn't closed the door. But the door had shifted. What had once felt wide open now seemed narrow, uncertain, maybe even rigged. I researched fertility statistics, scrolled through forums full of acronyms and hopeful heartbreak. I learned about IVF, surrogacy, adoption timelines, but none of it touched the ache that had settled in my chest. Because it wasn't just about biology. It was about belonging, continuity, a body that worked the way it was meant to. I had always imagined motherhood as something sacred, not in a sentimental way, but as a form of legacy, passing on love, story, resilience. Now I wondered if that lineage would end with me, and if so, what would remain. I didn't tell many people, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't have the language. People understand grief when it's tied to loss, but how do you grieve something that never had the chance to begin? One evening, my mother came to visit. She brought flowers and pie, the kind of quiet offering she made when words felt insufficient. We sat on the couch, the TV playing low in the background, neither of us really watching. She reached over and placed her hand on mine. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," she said. I nodded, but inside I felt the urgency like a drumbeat. I didn't want time. I wanted control. I wanted certainty. I wanted my body back, and with it, all the futures I used to count on without question. That night, I wrote in my journal, what if motherhood isn't about blood? What if it's about choosing to create even when your body can't? What if healing isn't about restoring the old life, but building something new from the rubble? The words surprised me. They didn't erase the pain, but they softened its edges. They reminded me that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of shaping something meaningful, even if it didn't look the way I had once imagined. Because maybe the truest form of creation isn't what grows inside us, but what grows because of us, what we nurture, what we love, what we refuse to give up on even when everything feels broken. And maybe, just maybe, that could still be enough. The treatment plan arrived like a sentence, precise, structured, and heavy with implications. Anti-parasitic medication. Aggressive, systemic, 3 rounds, blood work every week, imaging every month. Possibility of side effects ranging from nausea to hallucinations. A precaution, Dr. Lewis said, but better safe than sorry. I nodded through her explanation, my mouth dry, my fingers clenched in my lap. My mother sat beside me, a silent witness, her worry barely hidden beneath her calm. The first dose came in a small white pill, unremarkable in appearance. But as I swallowed it with a glass of water, I felt something shift, not physically, not yet, but emotionally, symbolically. This was war now, not observation, not analysis, elimination. The side effects were brutal. Nausea hit within hours, deep and clinging. I couldn't keep food down. Sleep came in fragments, punctuated by sweats and trembling. My joints ached. My skin flushed hot, then cold. I lost 5 pounds in a week and stopped recognizing my own reflection. I had the look of someone being undone from the inside out, but I kept going. Each morning, I took the pill with the precision of a ritual. I wrote down the side effects in a notebook, my second body, a paper version of what I couldn't control. I learned to count pain differently, not as an enemy, but as proof that the medicine was working, that something inside me was dying, and with it, I hoped, the fear. Still, it wasn't just the physical symptoms that tested me. It was the isolation, the kind of solitude that lingers even when someone is sitting next to you. My mother stayed through the first round. She cooked, cleaned, tried to distract me with stories about her garden, her neighbors, anything but what was happening inside me. One night, as I lay curled on the bathroom floor after another wave of vomiting, she sat beside me and held my hair back like she had when I was a child. I rested my head on her knee and whispered, "I'm scared." She didn't respond with comfort. She responded with truth. "So am I," she said softly, and somehow that helped more than anything else could have. Because what I needed wasn't reassurance. I needed company in the dark. The second round was worse. By then, the novelty of illness had worn off. Fatigue became a baseline. My skin turned sallow, my hair thinned. I stopped checking my emails, stopped answering calls. The world shrank to 4 rooms, bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, clinic. Dr. Lewis monitored my labs closely. "We're seeing progress," she said. "Your body is responding, slowly, but it's responding." Progress felt like such a strange word, too clinical, too distant. What I felt wasn't progress. It was erosion. But I clung to her optimism the way a drowning person clings to driftwood. I didn't care what she saw in the numbers. I just needed someone to tell me I wasn't disappearing. By the time the third round began, I had stopped hoping to feel like myself again. Instead, I focused on endurance, on surviving the next hour, the next pill, the next wave of fatigue that threatened to pull me under. I moved like someone underwater, slow, deliberate, as if time itself had thickened around me. The clinic had become a second home. I knew the nurses by name, recognized the way they smiled when trying to hide bad news. Blood draws became routine. I stopped flinching. My veins, once shy, had given up resistance. They offered themselves like tired roads. One afternoon, as I sat in the waiting room under flickering fluorescent lights, I overheard a nurse say something to a new patient. "It's going to get worse before it gets better." The words weren't meant for me, but they landed anyway. I repeated them to myself later that night, whispering them like a mantra as I lay in the dark, stomach twisted in knots, bones aching from the inside. worse before better. Maybe that was true of more than just the body, because something else was shifting, not healing exactly, but rearranging. I had become intimate with fragility, learned to live inside its architecture. There was a strange clarity in that. Stripped of pretense, of energy, of even the illusion of control, I could finally see the bones of who I was, not the version shaped by ambition or approval, not the woman who smiled through meetings or laughed politely at things that didn't feel funny, but the raw core beneath all that, the part that simply wanted to live, honestly, quietly, fully, and maybe in some strange way the parasite had helped reveal her. I don't mean to romanticize it. There was nothing noble about the pain, nothing beautiful about the vomiting, the insomnia, the days when I could barely walk from bed to bathroom. But pain had stripped away the noise, and in its silence I heard something honest. My mother left after the final dose. She kissed my forehead and promised she'd be back soon. "Call me if you need anything," she said. "I will," I lied, because I needed to be alone now. Not because I was strong, but because I needed to know who I was without anyone filling the silence. One morning, weeks later, I woke up and noticed something different. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a shift, like a room you've always known had been painted overnight. The nausea was gone. My head felt clear. I stood, walked to the kitchen, made coffee, and realized I hadn't thought about the creature in days. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stood there, barefoot on the cold tile, listening to the sound of the kettle begin to whistle. It was the most alive I had felt in months. Healing doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or milestones or sudden light pouring through a window. It comes in fragments, in the way your body forgets, little by little, what pain used to feel like. It comes when you realize you've gone a whole day without remembering you were once unwell. For me, it began with sound. The kettle, the morning after the nausea stopped, whistled like any other day. But for the first time in months, I didn't dread it. I didn't feel the urge to silence it, to mute the world, to retreat inward. I just let it sing. And in that moment, I knew something inside me had shifted, not returned, because I wasn't returning to anything, but moved forward. I stood in the kitchen holding a cup of tea and realized I wasn't bracing myself anymore. My shoulders had softened. My breath came deeper. I had no more medication scheduled, no more hospital visits on the calendar, no more symptoms, at least not the kind I could name. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was spacious. That week I cleaned the apartment, not because I had to, but because I wanted to reclaim it. I washed the linens, opened the windows, donated the sweaters I'd buried myself in. There was something sacred about letting air touch the corners of rooms that had been dimmed by illness, as if the walls, too, needed to breathe. I pulled out my journal and read through the entries, some scribbled in pain, some barely legible. So many pages ended with ellipses, unfinished thoughts that now felt like echoes of a past version of me, suspended in survival. And yet, I didn't tear them out, because she had gotten me here. The woman who wrote those words, the one who whispered her way through nausea, who traced invisible scars on her belly, who dreamed in silence and feared the sound of her own name, she had endured. And I owed her something, not erasure, not replacement, but gratitude. I wasn't cured. I don't think I ever would be, not in the way people think of when they hear that word. There was no reset button, no blank slate. But I was whole in a new and unfamiliar way, a body no longer under siege, a mind no longer waiting for the next blow. I called Dr. Lewis and left a message, not to ask a question, not to request more results, but just to say thank you. It felt strange saying those words, but necessary. Her voice had been one of the only steady ones in the chaos, and now, in the quiet aftermath, I wanted her to know she'd mattered. I didn't know what would come next. But for the first time, that didn't terrify me. I started walking again. Not for exercise or distraction, but because my body wanted movement. After so many months of shrinking, of curling into corners, of staying small to conserve energy, the act of walking felt revolutionary. I would step outside just as the sun began to rise, when the world was still stretching into itself. There was comfort in that early hush, in sidewalks that hadn't yet been claimed by traffic or noise. Each step was a quiet declaration, I am still here. I passed by familiar places that now felt unfamiliar, stores I hadn't entered in nearly a year, cafes I used to frequent before I began disappearing. The city hadn't changed, but I had. I no longer moved through the world invisibly. I noticed things again. A crack in the pavement I'd never seen before. The soft hum of an air conditioner in a nearby window. The way the leaves moved even when there was no wind. One morning I passed a playground. Children shouted and chased one another, their voices high and wild with joy. For a moment, something in me ached, an echo of the pain I'd carried in Chapter 8, the fear of a future without motherhood. But then a boy tripped, fell, and a woman, his mother, I assumed, rushed over. She cradled him gently, checked his palms, wiped away tears. There was love there, yes, but also exhaustion, realness. And I realized something. I could love deeply, fiercely, even if my body never carried a child. I could still be a vessel for nurture, for story, for care. Later that day, I sat at the window with a cup of tea, watching the light shift across my floor. And for the first time in a long while, I did something I hadn't dared in months. I made a list. Not a to-do list, not goals, but a list of what I wanted to feel in the life that lay ahead. And spaciousness and honesty, safety and purpose and joy, not constant but real, and touch that feels like home. Mornings that don't begin in fear, and nights that end in peace. I didn't know how to get all of those things. I didn't even know if I believed I deserved them, but naming them felt like a beginning. The body I lived in had been invaded, broken open, worn thin, but it had also carried me to the other side, and that mattered. I stopped wishing to go back to the version of myself from before. She was gone, and maybe that was okay, because the woman sitting by the window now, tea in hand, eyes soft, breathing deep, wasn't broken. She was rebuilding. The first time I opened a blank document to write about what had happened, I stared at the screen for nearly an hour. The cursor blinked like a challenge, asking if I was ready to speak. I wasn't sure, not because I didn't remember, but because I remembered too much, viscerally, cellularly. My body still held echoes of the nights I couldn't sleep, of the mornings when I woke to fear before I opened my eyes, but silence had never saved me. And now, in the stillness that followed survival, I felt the need to speak, not to retell what I had already lived, but to understand it, to shape it, to reclaim it from the language of medical charts and lab results and fold it back into something human. I started with a single sentence. My body was once home to something that did not belong to me. It was stark, true, and it gave me a place to begin. I wrote in fragments at first, scenes, images, moments that had branded themselves into memory. The smell of antiseptic in the exam room, the hush in Dr. Lewis's voice when she said parasite, the way my hands shook when I touched my belly, half expecting it to ripple again. Then came the emotions. I wrote about the disbelief, the loneliness, the shame I didn't know I carried until I spoke it aloud, and slowly, sentence by sentence, the shame began to lift. It transformed into something else, grief maybe, but also clarity. I didn't write to educate, at least not at first. I wrote to survive differently, to live again in a new language, one that didn't flinch from truth but also didn't abandon tenderness. Eventually, I submitted the story, just a short version, to an online medical blog. A few weeks later, it was published under a pseudonym. I thought nothing would come of it, but then the comments started to appear. Women wrote to say they had experienced unexplained symptoms for years, that they had been dismissed, that they had stopped trusting their own bodies. Some had answers, most didn't. But what united them wasn't diagnosis, it was the ache of being unheard. That was when I realized the story wasn't just mine. It belonged to every person who had ever been doubted, dismissed, or disbelieved, every person who had lived with pain and been told it was in their head, every person who had feared their body more than any external threat. And maybe, by telling it, I was doing more than remembering. Maybe I was building a bridge. In the months that followed, the story traveled farther than I expected. I received emails from readers, some short, others pages long, women, men, people in their 20s, in their 60s. Some wrote to say thank you. Others wrote because they didn't know who else would understand. I read each one slowly, holding their words like fragile artifacts. I was no expert, no healer, but I understood something they didn't have to explain: the fear of being dismissed, the betrayal of a body, the relief of finally being seen. A professor from a nearby medical school reached out and asked if I would speak to a group of graduating students. "We're studying cases of diagnostic delay," she wrote, "but yours speaks to something deeper, the emotional cost of being unheard." I hesitated. Public speaking wasn't my comfort zone. But the invitation lingered. I thought about the rooms I had sat in, sterile and bright, While someone in a lab coat told me I was fine, I thought about how calm their voices were, how easy it was for them to send me home with nothing but a vague diagnosis and a bottle of supplements. And I thought, what if even one of those students became the kind of doctor who listened the way Dr. Lewis had? So I said yes. When the day came, I stood at the front of a quiet auditorium, hands trembling around a printed page. I didn't tell them everything, but I told them enough. I spoke about the weight of uncertainty, about how pain without explanation begins to rewrite who you think you are, about the way silence can feel like a second diagnosis, one that seeps into every part of you, unnamed and untreated. They listened. Some took notes, some just watched, but when I finished, there was a stillness that felt different than polite applause. It felt like recognition. Afterward, a student approached me. She couldn't have been more than 23. "Thank you," she said. That changes how I think about everything. And just like that, the shame I once carried curled into something smaller, something I could hold without it consuming me. I started writing more, not always about the parasite, sometimes about healing, about identity, about bodies that bend and break and find new ways to be whole. I didn't have answers, only stories. But sometimes, stories are enough. They don't fix what happened, but they remind us we weren't alone while it did. And in that, there's power. There are things that live in you long after they've left your body. Some of them are physical, scar tissue, weakness, memory stored in muscle. But others are quieter, more persistent. They don't show up in blood work or scans. They live in the way you flinch when someone says, "You look healthy now," as if recovery has a single face. They live in how you wake in the middle of the night, not from pain, but from the echo of pain. They live in how you ask yourself, months later, was it really that bad? And then remember, yes, it was. I used to think the thing inside me was the worst part, that foreign creature feeding on me. But the real intruder wasn't just the parasite, it was the doubt it left behind. Because after trauma, there's always a question, can I trust what I feel? And worse, can I trust myself? But maybe the miracle is this, that we feel anything at all. It's been a year since my last treatment. A year since the last blood test came back clean. Dr. Lewis called me herself, voice light for the first time in our long history. "We got it," she said. "You're clear." I thanked her, then I sat down at the kitchen table and cried, not out of relief, but because I didn't know what to do with the quiet. Sometimes pain becomes a rhythm. When it ends, there's no applause, just silence. And in that silence, you begin again. Now, I live differently, not cautiously, but attentively. I listen to my body, not as a threat, but as a partner. I eat slower, I sleep earlier, I say no more often. I don't apologize for resting. I no longer chase the version of me from before. She was brave, yes, but she was also tired all the time and too proud to admit it. The woman I am now isn't braver, just softer, and somehow that's stronger. I still write, some days about illness, some days about healing, but mostly about being. About how to hold space for contradictions, fear and hope, grief and joy, fragility and resilience. I teach others now, not as an expert, but as a witness, a translator of the body's strange and sacred language. Last month, I stood in front of a room full of medical students again. This time, I didn't bring notes. I told them about the ultrasound, about the silence, about the moment I realized something was moving inside me that should not have been there. I told them that the hardest part wasn't the sickness, it was not being believed. I told them to trust their patients, even when the symptoms sound strange. I told them the truth. When I finished, one of the students raised her hand and asked, "Do you feel like that thing ever really left?" I paused. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to give her a clean answer. But what came out instead was this. Some things leave your body. Others, they stay but change shape. They stop haunting and start teaching. They become part of you, but not in the way they intended. She nodded slowly, and I knew she understood. Because maybe healing isn't about forgetting. Maybe it's about making peace with the ghosts. Later that night, I walked home in the cool dark. The city pulsed around me, normal, alive. I looked up at the windows of the apartments above, lit with yellow light, families eating dinner, someone playing piano, laughter echoing from a balcony. And I thought, what lives in you? What story is your body holding, waiting for you to hear? Mine once held a parasite. Now it holds 1,000 pages. Now it holds me. Sometimes what nearly breaks us becomes the very thing that rebuilds us. Emily's story isn't just about a medical mystery. It's about listening to your body when no one else will. It's about reclaiming your voice after it's been silenced. And it's about how healing doesn't always mean going back. Sometimes it means becoming someone new. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of your own resilience, or of someone you love who's been through something unexplainable, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, because somewhere out there someone needs to hear this too, and we'll be right here telling the stories no one else dares to tell.